Coming up on Arirang News, the Bank of Korea decides to keep its key interest rate unchanged at 0.5%. There had been expectations for a rate hike because of the country's strong economic growth and rising home prices, but it seems that's been put on hold. South Korea's car exports rose in the first half of this year by almost 28% from a year earlier, the biggest gain since 2014. That rise was led by eco-friendly vehicles. And South Korea reports 1,600 new cases of COVID-19 as the fourth wave of the virus continues. 6 sailors on board a Navy ship off the coast of Africa have caught it too. Medical support is on the way. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. The Bank of Korea is again keeping its benchmark interest rate of 0.5%. It's also sticking with its economic growth outlook for this year at 4%. There have been growing expectations of a rate hike, but it seems the surge in virus cases might delay that. Min Soo-kyun reports.
South Korea's central bank has kept its benchmark interest rate unchanged at a record low of 0.5%. The decision was made on Thursday during the central bank's monetary policy meeting. The rate freeze comes as the bank aims to offset looming uncertainties from the fourth wave of the pandemic. The Bank of Korea cut its key interest rate to a record low 0.5% in May last year. Since then, the rate has been left untouched for over a year. Some analysts had expected policymakers to start raising interest rates by the second quarter of this year over rising property prices and household debt. But the central bank believes it's too early to discuss a change in monetary policy.
Despite signs of economic recovery, we have decided to keep the benchmark interest rate steady, as we believe it's necessary to keep an eye on the economic impact from the latest wave of COVID-19.
The BOK, however, did mention the possibility of a rate hike within this year, saying that if virus cases come under control and the economy fares well, the key interest rate could be raised. The central bank also kept South Korea's economic outlook for this year unchanged. It projected a 4% growth in GDP for 2021, the same as the previous forecast made in May. This follows strong exports and facility investment and improving employment figures. When it comes to consumer price inflation, the central bank expects it to hover in the lower to mid 2% range due to rising prices of petroleum products and agricultural, livestock, and fishery goods. Min Soo-kyun, Arirang News.
Globally, the pandemic's caused a backlog in computer chips that go in cars. But South Korea's vehicle exports soared nonetheless in the first half of the year. Local automakers say that's thanks to strong demand for eco-friendly cars. Bae Eun-ji reports.
The South Korean automobile industry's exports soared in the first half of the year, despite a global shortage of semiconductors in the industry. According to Seoul's Trade Ministry Thursday, auto exports amounted to some $23.6 billion, a high not seen since the first half of 2014. Outbound shipments surged almost 28% on year, recording double-digit growth for the first time in 9 years. The strong performance was led by sales of eco-friendly cars, which spiked more than 37%. The country shipped around 173,000 units, selling more than $5 billion worth of vehicles for the first time ever overseas. Exports of hybrid cars soared more than 63%, and electric cars almost 14%. As for at home, sales fell around 2% due to the base effect, but local auto production was up 11.5%, manufacturing a total of 1.8 million units. Sales of eco-friendly cars accounted for more than 17% of the nation total. This is twice the amount seen in the first half of 2019, before the pandemic struck. With new models in the works for the second half, including the G80 EV and EV6, the Trade Ministry says eco-friendly car sales should maintain an upward trend for the time being. Bae Eun-ji, Arirang News.
Data show the number of passengers on domestic flights in South Korea has recovered to its pre-pandemic level, but it'll still be some time before the same is true for international flights. According to the Transport Ministry, the number of passengers on domestic flights in the first half of this year rose 45% from a year earlier to around 150 million. That's only around 3% below the figure before the pandemic in 2019. International passengers, however, were still down 97% from 2 years ago at just 1.2 million passengers. The Transport Ministry said it'll continue to support a recovery in international air travel by working to expand South Korea's travel bubbles with other countries. In the pandemic last year, South Korea saw an unprecedented decline in its number of foreign residents and an even higher number of its citizens returning from overseas. According to Statistics Korea, there was an exodus of 130,000 foreigners who'd been staying long-term, that is, longer than 90 days. It was also the first time in 11 years that the outflow of foreigners surpassed the inflow. At the same time, the number of Korean nationals returning to the country during the same period jumped 41% to surpass 240,000. The agency said a large portion of those were Korean students and people employed abroad. China's economy grew a little more slowly than expected in the second quarter of this year, 7.9% year on year. Major reasons for that include higher commodity prices and supply chain issues. Experts say lower growth in China could affect South Korea's economic growth as well this year. Seong reports.
China's economy is still growing, but at a slower pace than expected. The country's National Bureau of Statistics reported that its gross domestic product increased by 7.9% in the second quarter compared to the previous year. That figure is about 10 percentage points lower than what the country registered in the first quarter. However, experts say that the outstanding first quarter growth largely reflected how much the economy was harmed by the pandemic a year ago, and a slower on-year growth for the second quarter was somewhat expected.
People did expect growth to slow down a little bit because China was withdrawing fiscal and monetary stimulus that they used during the coronavirus last year. And China had been having some problems with inflation in raw materials and commodities, decline in demand for services because of spreading of coronavirus in some regional areas. Shipping backlogs and rise in energy prices.
He said that China is still on track to achieve its target growth rate of 6%. That is mainly because its retail sales in June jumped 12% on year, which indicates that the slower growth was mainly from supply problems rather than a lack of demand. But should China's growth fall short of expectations, this could in turn affect Korea's economy.
Korean exports to China rose by 23.8% during the first half of the year. If Korea wants to achieve 4% economic growth this year, exports to China will be critical. If the Chinese growth slows down more than expected, then it'll be harder to achieve that 4% growth.
And the expert added that Korea could face similar challenges to those which slowed down China's growth, namely higher prices of commodities and raw materials and shipping bottlenecks, and the country needs to deal with these problems to achieve its growth targets. 서은경, 아리랑 뉴스.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Kim Se-won, Professor of Economics at Ewha Women's University. Professor Kim, good to have you back on.
Good afternoon, Devin.
Well, the Bank of Korea today decided to keep its key interest rate where it is at an all-time low. There's been a degree of pressure on the BOK to raise rates under certain circumstances, but it seems this decision, at least in part, is related to the fourth wave of the virus. Tell us about this decision at the BOK.
There is a strong expectation on central bank's interest rate hikes in second half of this year due to higher inflation and financial instability. But today, Bank of Korea decided to leave the key interest rate at current level of 0.5% because of worsened coronavirus situation. Even though Bank of Korea is giving strong signal of raising interest rate until the end of this year, it won't be easy to raise interest rate because the higher interest rate can neutralize the effects of government's emergency supporting program financed by over 30 trillion won supplementary budget. So my expectation is when Bank of Korea is about to raise key interest rate in the fall, there will be strong pressure from ruling party and government. It means that Bank of Korea should persuade ruling party and government that stabilizing inflation and financial market is more important than recovering economy.
Well, inflation in the U.S. last month we see is at its highest since the financial crisis 13 years ago. Consumer prices rising by 5.4% from a year earlier. Fed Chair Jerome Powell, though, saying he still expects inflation to come down and he's not planning to raise rates sooner than previously forecast. Professor, tell us what's happening with inflation and the Fed on that front.
In previous FOMC meeting in June, U.S. Fed said that high inflation in U.S. will be stabilized very soon. But high inflation goes on with 5.4% inflation in June, which is the highest level in 13 years. Overall, this stronger inflation pressure means that the possibility of tapering or less money supplied by Fed would be closer than expected. Mr. Powell, however, repeatedly emphasized that he still expects price pressure to ease later this year. But he actually left the door open to raising key interest rates by saying that the central bank wouldn't hesitate to raise interest rates to keep inflation under control. So depending on the path of inflation over summer, the direction and timing of the Fed's tapering and interest rate change will be more clearly seen.
Well, turning to the markets, stocks on Wall Street overnight were mixed. The Fed perhaps playing into that. Tech shares on the NASDAQ closed lower again, but it was a gain on the S&P and the Dow. What's the story in the global markets?
Mr. Powell's speech at Congress yesterday gave a breathing space to Wall Street. He clearly supports expansionary monetary policy of zero interest rate and ample liquidity supply to the market under current circumstances of U.S. economy. But U.S. market had different response to Mr. Powell's speech yesterday. Dow Jones gained 0.1%, but NASDAQ lost by 0.2% yesterday. But thanks to Mr. Powell's speech, 10-year Treasury yield decreased down to 1.3% from previous 1.4% in a day. Most of the European markets fell between 0.1% and 0.7% due to stronger inflation pressure in Eurozone and European Central Bank's possibility of key interest rate adjustment.
Yeah, and interestingly, we saw the exchange rate here in Korea come down significantly from about 11.50 down to about 11.41. And Korean stocks were higher today, too, largely, it seems, on Powell's comments. The Kospi getting a little closer back to that 3,300 mark it crossed recently. The Kosdaq with an even bigger gain today. Tell us about the domestic market.
Domestic market positively responded to Mr. Powell's speech on keeping ease monetary policy today, and Bank of Korea's decision of not to change key interest rate at 0.5% also gave another positive momentum to the market. Kospi recovered yesterday's loss with 0.7% return today. Kosdaq market also gained 0.9% with a fourth straight day rise, including today. Particularly, both markets' rise was led by foreign investors' stock purchase. On the other hand, domestic individual investors sold stocks.
And in Korea, data show that import prices rose last month again to their highest level in 6 years and 9 months. Export prices, too, up for a 7th month in a row. What's behind the rise in prices coming in and going out?
According to Bank of Korea, last month's import price has increased by 2.3% in monthly basis, and it is a highest increase since September 2014. The main factors of higher import prices are skyrocketing oil price and other natural deposit prices, like coal and iron ore. in June. Dubai oil price increased by almost 8% in a month, and coal price also increased by about 5% in a month. The problem related to higher import price is that it drives up domestic price level even higher. Recently, domestic inflation has exceeded 2%, which is Bank of Korea's inflation target over 3 straight months. So it is more expected that domestic inflation will stay higher due to higher import price.
All right, Professor Kim, we'll keep an eye on that. As always, thank you for sharing your time with us today. We always appreciate your insights.
Thank you very much.
South Korea's new coronavirus cases today were only slightly down from the all-time high the day before, right at 1,600, and a growing proportion of them occurring outside the greater Seoul area. As for vaccines, the authorities are now accepting reservations from people in their 50s. Kim Dami reports.
South Korea has added 1,600 new COVID-19 cases on Thursday, seeing over 1,000 cases a day for 9 straight days now. The number of cases from outside the metropolitan area also exceeded the 400 mark for the first time, taking up nearly 30% of Wednesday's figure. To tame the fourth wave of the pandemic, the government has enforced level 2 distancing measures in 10 cities and provinces across the country starting Thursday. Under level 2, private gatherings will be limited to a maximum of 8 people, but restrictions also vary by region. As of Wednesday, 30.6% of South Koreans have been vaccinated with at least 1 dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. To speed up the country's vaccination program, reservations for those in their mid and late 50s resumed on Wednesday. Though the booking website crashed for 2 hours due to a server overload, the system is now back online. Starting next Monday, people in the early 50s will also be able to book their shots. Bookings for those aged between 53 and 54 will start at 8 p.m. Monday. Those aged between 50 and 52 can book their shots from 8 p.m. Tuesday. For future rounds of the vaccine rollout, local health authorities are considering using a rotation system similar to the one used at the start of the pandemic for buying masks on designated days. Kim Dami, Arirang News.
And 6 crew members serving with the South Korean Navy's anti-piracy unit off the coast of Africa have tested positive for COVID-19. Help is on the way, but because they're in close quarters on board a ship and dozens of others have symptoms, there are concerns about a massive outbreak. Kim Ji-yeon reports.
6 military service members stationed with the South Korean Navy's Cheonghae Unit fighting piracy off waters near the Gulf of Aden have tested positive for COVID-19. This has sparked fears of a massive cluster breaking out of their destroyer, which has some 300 people on board and is now in the coast of Africa. The tests were done on people showing symptoms. The results of some 80 personnel have not yet been released, and they're currently isolated from the rest of the crew. The infection route is not yet clear, but one crewman who first showed symptoms of pneumonia on Wednesday was found to have helped transport military supplies at an undisclosed port late last month. The officer was sent to hospital to be tested. What's worrisome is that the crew are kept in close proximity to each other, living and carrying out missions together for months. All of the crew had tested negative for the virus before their ship left Busan in February, but none of them had been vaccinated, unlike other units overseas, since they left before South Korea started its vaccination campaign later that month. The South Korean military says it's communicating with other countries to arrange tests for all of the crew members.
The military is prioritizing the safety of its personnel deployed overseas and is doing utmost to prevent the further spread of virus. The military is in close consultations with related countries and agencies to carry out appropriate measures, including deploying the military's multi-role tank transport aircraft to bring the crew back for treatment.
President Moon Jae-in had called for the prompt transfer of medical staff and supplies, and he ordered the military to carry out prevention measures for other deployed service members as well. So far, out of 1,300 personnel deployed overseas, some 960 have been vaccinated on a voluntary basis. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
Indonesia has become the new epicenter of the pandemic in Asia, with daily cases there yet again reaching an all-time high. Indonesia, too, is fighting the Delta variant. There are some 22,000 South Koreans living in Indonesia, hundreds of whom have been infected, and there's a shortage of hospital beds. Choi Min-jung reports.
A plane carrying 9 South Korean COVID-19 patients arrived at Incheon International Airport earlier this week. These patients are from Indonesia, the worst-hit country in Southeast Asia. Patients wore personal isolation equipment during the flight, and 6 were given oxygen.
Personally, it's extremely scary how before all of these COVID victims and patients are only seen through the screen. However, now it's actually happening around me, and my friends and acquaintances are getting the virus, and some of them were unfortunate.
As of Wednesday, 260 Korean nationals have contracted the virus in Indonesia. The Korean Association in Indonesia says the actual number of Koreans infected is double or even triple the current number when including those unreported cases. There have been 14 Korean deaths so far, with the majority reported since Indonesia's daily tally began to skyrocket in June.
People need to be hospitalized and receive treatment when symptoms worsen from being mild to severe, but they can't. The fundamental problem is that there is an overwhelming shortage of wards, doctors, and nurses in hospitals.
Due to such shortages, nearly 80 people have been sent back to South Korea on air ambulances and chartered flights, and patients have to pay for these flights themselves. People pay more than $100,000 for an air ambulance, and for chartered flights, over $17,000 per person. In such dire situation, it seems the most important thing to do to contain the virus is to get vaccinated.
There are cases where Korean residents go to stand in line from 5 a.m. to get shots, and there are others who are cut off from the line and asked to come back at dawn the next day. I hope that people still make an effort to get vaccinated.
Indonesia is currently seeing some of the highest numbers of new cases of COVID-19 in the world. It confirmed a record 54,000 cases on Wednesday, bringing its total number of cases to nearly 2.7 million. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
The new Level 4 social distancing measures in the Seoul area are impacting the cultural scene. With the weekend just around the corner, theaters and museums have had to make some quick adjustments on closing times, seating, and so on. Our culture correspondent Kim Bo-kyung has the details.
Theaters' timetables have been wrecked. As the social distancing measures have been beefed up to level 4, theaters are trying hard to adjust to the government's directions. They need to close by 10 p.m., so many are running shows earlier or shortening performances to fit them in before closing time. For example, the musical Marie Antoinette, which kicked off on Tuesday, started half an hour early but still had to make further changes to fit in its 3-hour runtime.
We normally take a 20-minute intermission to change the stage set between Act 1 and 2. To finish the show before 10, we shorten it to 15 minutes. Also, we normally have long curtain calls, but also shorten that time. After the show, visitors usually stay at the lobby to buy merchandise, but we ask them not to stay.
Movie theaters have also been hit.
Since we can only operate until 10, we need to have the last screening time start by 7:30 p.m. Compared to previous social distancing levels, 1 or 2 screenings per screen have been reduced.
Previously, up to 4 companions were able to sit together, yet as gatherings to watch theatrical performances or films are considered a private activity, only 2 people can sit together with every other seat left vacant. Meanwhile, as music concerts at places other than official concert halls have been banned, the 2021 Together Again K-pop concert, which was scheduled for this Saturday at SK Handball Stadium in Olympic Park, has been switched to an online show. Museums and art galleries have reduced the number of visitors they can receive to just 30% of what they would have been allowed under Level 1 restrictions, and they have increased the number of visitors who need to book in advance. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.